Sicily, Italy, November 14th, 1944. Private James Washington of the 92nd Infantry Division, one of only two all-black combat units in the U.S. Army during World War II, crouched in a destroyed farmhouse outside the village of Sommocolonia, listening to German artillery getting closer and knowing that his unit was about to be overrun. He was 22 years old, had been in Italy for 4 months, and was going to die in a country he'd never heard of before, fighting alongside white soldiers who mostly refused to eat with him or sleep near him, or acknowledge that black men could be real soldiers. But in that destroyed farmhouse, bleeding from shrapnel wounds and down to his last magazine of ammunition, James Washington heard something that would change 2 lives forever. Someone crying, not screaming, not calling for help, just crying quietly, the sound of a man who'd given up hope. If you're watching this story about Carlo Gambino paying for a black veteran's house because of what happened in World War II, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from, and subscribe so you never miss the stories that prove honor and gratitude can transcend decades. Your engagement helps the story reach people who need to hear it. James crawled toward the sound, found a man in civilian clothes hiding in what remained of the farmhouse cellar. Italian, maybe 30 years old, wounded in the leg, trapped when the building had been shelled earlier that day. The man had looked at James with absolute terror, not because of the German artillery, because James was black. Because even in 1944 Italy, even facing death, some people's first reaction to seeing a Negro was fear. James had ignored the reaction, had learned to ignore it, had spent his entire life ignoring it. He'd pulled the Italian man from the cellar, had checked his wound, a deep gash in the thigh, but not life-threatening if it got treated soon. The Italian had tried to speak. Broken English mixed with Italian. Trying to explain something, trying to tell James something important. My name Carlo Gambino. I am from New York, Brooklyn. I come back to Sicily to see family. War start. I get trapped here, cannot leave. Germans everywhere. Please help me. I pay you. I have money in America. I pay you anything. James had almost laughed. Almost. Because here was an Italian man offering money to a Negro soldier who made $78 a month and who couldn't even eat at the same lunch counter as white people back home. I don't want your money, James had said. But I'm getting you out of here anyway because that's what soldiers do. We help people. Even when those people look at us like we're something to be afraid of. The German advance had been moving fast. James's unit was pulling back, retreating toward Allied lines 3 miles south. If James stayed to help Carlo, he'd be left behind, cut off, probably captured or killed. If you left Carlo, the wounded Italian would definitely be found by Germans, would probably be shot as a suspected partisan or left to die in the rubble. James had made his choice in about 3 seconds. He'd pulled Carlo onto his back, had carried him. 160 pounds of wounded Italian civilian plus his own equipment plus his weapon. Had carried him 3 miles through Italian countryside while German artillery shelled the area, and while his own unit retreated ahead of him. He'd fallen twice, had gotten up both times, had kept moving because stopping meant dying and dying meant Carlo died too, and James Washington hadn't survived 22 years in the country that hated him just to let someone die when he could prevent it. They'd reached Allied lines at 4:37 a.m. on November 15th. James had collapsed, had been so exhausted he couldn't stand. Medics had taken Carlo, had treated his wound, had asked James why he'd risked his life for an Italian civilian. James hadn't had a good answer, had just said it seemed like the right thing to do. Carlo had been evacuated to a field hospital. James had returned to his unit. They'd never seen each other again. The war had separated them. Carlo eventually made it back to New York. James survived the war and came home to Brooklyn in 1946. And for 18 years, Carlo Gambino had been looking for the black soldier who'd saved his life, the man who'd carried him 3 miles through German artillery. The man who'd risked everything for a stranger who'd looked at him with fear instead of gratitude. But Carlo only knew the man's first name. James. Knew he was from the 92nd Infantry Division. Knew he was from somewhere in New York. That was all. No last name. No address. Nothing that would help find one black veteran among thousands who'd served in Italy. Carlo Gambino had become, by 1962, the boss of one of New York's 5 Mafia families. Had built power through intelligence and strategy rather than violence. Had connections throughout the city. Had resources that most people couldn't imagine, and he'd used those resources to search. Had hired investigators, had contacted veterans organizations, had searched military records that technically shouldn't have been accessible to civilians, had followed every lead, no matter how thin. This is where 18 years of searching finally ends, and Carlo Gambino proves that some debts matter more than power or money. If you're still watching, comment below what city you're from and hit subscribe, because what happens next shows that honor has no expiration date. Every comment and subscription helps more people discover these untold stories. In March 1962, one of Gambino's investigators found a lead. A James Washington, black, age 40, living in a rundown apartment in Bedford-Stuyvesant, had served in the 92nd Infantry Division in Italy during the war, worked as a janitor at a Brooklyn elementary school, lived alone, never married, struggled with injuries from the war that made physical labor difficult. Gambino had gone to verify the identification himself, had waited outside the elementary school where James worked, had watched this man, 18 years older than when they'd last met, limp out of the building at the end of his shift, carrying a mop and bucket, his shoulders bent from years of hard work. And Gambino had recognized him immediately. The same face, older, worn by time and poverty and probably pain. But the same man who'd carried him 3 miles through German fire when he could have saved himself instead. Gambino had approached carefully. Mr. Washington, James had turned, had looked at this well-dressed Italian man with suspicion. Can I help you? My name is Carlo Gambino. I don't know if you remember me. November 1944, Sommocolonia. You pulled me from a farmhouse cellar. You carried me 3 miles to safety. You saved my life. James had stared, had needed several seconds to process, then recognition had dawned. His eyes had widened. Carlo, the man from Sicily? Yes, Gambino had said, I've been looking for you for 18 years. I owe you my life. And I owe you something else. Something I should have given you in 1944, but couldn't because we were separated by the war. James had shaken his head. You don't owe me anything. I was a soldier. That's what we did. We helped people. Gambino had smiled. Sad smile. You helped me when you didn't have to. You risked your life for a stranger. For an Italian man who looked at you with fear instead of gratitude. You could have left me, should have left me, but you didn't. And for 18 years, I've had everything: money, power, success. While you, the man who saved me, have been working as a janitor in a school, living in poverty, struggling. That's not right. That's not honor. Over the next week, Gambino had learned everything about James Washington's life. Had learned that James had come home from the war with shrapnel still in his back, that he'd been denied veterans' benefits for years due to bureaucratic problems and probably racism, that he'd never been able to afford the surgery that might have relieved his constant pain. Had learned that James's wife had left him in 1952 when the poverty became too much, that James sent money every month to support a daughter he rarely saw, that James lived in a 1-room apartment with broken heating and shared a bathroom with 4 other tenants. Had learned that the school where James worked was going to close at the end of the year, that James would lose his job, that at age 40, with limited education and chronic pain, finding new employment would be almost impossible. And Gambino had decided what the debt required. On April 3rd, 1962, Gambino had arrived at James Washington's apartment, carrying a manila envelope, and accompanied by one bodyguard who waited respectfully in the hallway. James had invited him in, had offered coffee. The two men had sat in that tiny apartment, so different from Gambino's mansion in Brooklyn, and had talked about the war, about what happened after, about the 18 years between that November night in Italy and this April evening in Brooklyn. Then Gambino had placed the envelope on the small table between them. Mr. Washington, inside this envelope is the deed to a house. 3 bedrooms, full bathroom, kitchen, living room, basement, small yard, in Crown Heights, good neighborhood, good schools nearby for when your daughter visits. The house is paid for. Completely. No mortgage, no debt. It's yours. Free and clear. No mortgage, no debt. It's yours. Free and clear, because you carried me 3 miles when you could have left me. Because you saved my life when you had every reason to save only yourself. James had opened the envelope with shaking hands, had pulled out the deed, had read it. His name, the address, the official stamps and signatures that made it real. He'd started crying, not sobbing, just tears running down his face while he stared at a piece of paper that represented security he'd never imagined having. I can't accept this, James had said. This is too much. A whole house. This must have cost $40,000. Exactly $43,000, Gambino had confirmed, plus another $7,000 for the medical care you're going to receive. There's a surgeon, best in New York, is going to remove that shrapnel from your back. Fix what the war broke. You've lived in pain for 18 years. That's over now. And there's something else. A bank account with enough money that you'll never have to work as a janitor again unless you want to. You can retire. You can spend time with your daughter. You can live like the man who saved my life deserves to live. James had shaken his head, still crying. I was just doing what was right. I know. Gambino had said quietly, that's why this matters. Because you did what was right when it cost you everything and gave you nothing. You saved a stranger who didn't deserve your help. And you never asked for anything in return. But I'm giving you something anyway, because honor demands it. Because I've carried this debt for 18 years. Because every day I've lived since November 1944 was a day I owed to you. Before we finish this story, if you made it this far, drop a comment telling us what country you're watching from, and subscribe because sometimes gratitude takes 18 years, but it never expires. Your support helps us keep bringing these hidden histories to light. James Washington lived in that Crown Heights house until his death in 1989 at age 67. His daughter, who'd been 7 years old when her father came home from the war, reconnected with him, visited regularly, eventually moved in to care for him in his final years. The surgery Gambino paid for removed most of the shrapnel, relieved most of the pain, gave James 27 years without the constant agony that had defined his life since 1944. The money Gambino provided allowed James to volunteer, to mentor young black men in the neighborhood, to tell his story about the war, about carrying a wounded Italian 3 miles, about honor and duty and doing the right thing even when it's hard. Carlo Gambino never spoke publicly about what he'd done for James Washington, never sought recognition, never told the story to reporters or biographers. It remained private, a debt between 2 men. Honor fulfilled quietly. When Gambino died in 1976, James Washington attended the funeral, stood in the back of the church, cried quietly for the man who'd searched 18 years to repay a debt from a November night in Italy when they'd both been different people in a different world. And when James Washington died in 1989, his daughter found letters, dozens of them, from Carlo Gambino, written over the years between 1962 and 1976. Letters checking on James's health, asking about his daughter, offering help if it was needed. Letters from a mob boss to a janitor that showed a friendship built on mutual respect and on the understanding that some debts transcend money or power or social status. That's the story of November 1944 and April 1962, of Private James Washington, carrying Carlo Gambino 3 miles through German artillery. Of 18 years searching for a man whose last name he didn't know. Of a debt repaid with a house and medical care and the recognition that true honor means remembering who helped you when you needed it most. They say Carlo Gambino was a criminal, a mob boss, someone who built power through organized crime. And all of that was true. But they also say that honor matters, that gratitude has no expiration date, that a debt from 1944 deserves repayment at 1960, even when no one except the 2 men involved remembers it exists. Carlo Gambino spent 18 years and $50,000 repaying a debt to a black janitor that nobody knew about, and that nobody would have blamed him for forgetting. Because some men never forget who saved them. And some men understand that true power isn't about how much you can take. It's about how well you repay the debts you owe to people who asked for nothing and deserve everything. James Washington saved Carlo Gambino's life in 1944. Carlo Gambino gave James Washington his life back in 1962, and both men understood that honor, real honor, is measured not in grand gestures witnessed by crowds, but in quiet acts between two people who remember what really matters.